What if someone could hear tomorrow, before it happens? A man claims he does, and every prediction brings a darker mystery. Welcome to Mystery Files. I am your host, Raven. Before we begin, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from tonight. Seeing this global community gather is incredible. Your messages truly make these stories special. Now, let's begin. In the years of my companionship with Mr. Sherlock Holmes, there were certain mornings which, by their peculiar stillness, seemed to herald some singular disturbance before ever it reached our door. London itself, that immense and ceaseless organism, would appear to pause in its own breathing, as though some invisible hand had pressed upon its vast mechanical heart. It was upon such a morning, in the latter days of November, and that there occurred the first incident in that strange affair which I have set down under the title of The Case of the Man Who Heard the Future. The dawn had broken reluctantly over Baker Street. A wet and yellow fog clung to the windows, dimming the outlines of the opposite houses until they loomed like ghostly facades suspended in smoke. The dull rumble of wheels from the Marylebone Road came softened through the mist, while below us the occasional cry of a newspaper boy rose and fell in melancholy fashion, as if swallowed up by the very atmosphere. Holmes was stretched at length upon the settee in his dressing gown, his long, lean fingers joined at the tips, his eyes closed, though I knew from experience that no detail of our surroundings escaped him. Upon the table beside him lay a confusion of chemical apparatus, near a Persian slipper full of tobacco, and the monograph upon cigar ashes to which he had lately been adding several observations with all the concentration of a medieval scholar illuminating a manuscript. For my part, I sat near the fire with a medical journal upon my knee, though I confess that my mind had wandered some distance from the article before me. There was something in the oppressive weather, or perhaps in Holmes's own unusual silence, which disposed me more to reflection than to study. "You are reading the same paragraph for the fourth time, Watson," said Holmes suddenly. I looked up in some irritation, for his eyes remained closed and his attitude unchanged. "You have an unfair advantage, Holmes." "By no means. The page has not been turned for 7 minutes. Twice you have drawn your forefinger along the margin, now which is your habit when endeavoring to fix your attention. You then gave it up altogether and fell to staring at the condensation upon the window pane. A man absorbed in his subject does not observe rain tracing irregular pathways through soot. "You might at least open your eyes when you play these tricks," said I. He smiled faintly. "My dear fellow, one should economize one's faculties. Besides, I have need of them presently." "For what?" "For the gentleman upon the stairs." Even as he spoke, I heard it. The creak of a foot upon the 17th stair, a pause, then 2 hurried steps, then another pause. There came next the firm but uncertain tap of a cane against the hall stand below, followed by Mrs. Hudson's voice in subdued conversation. "You knew someone was coming." Holmes opened his eyes now, and in them there shone that cold brightness which was to him what the stirrup is to a cavalry horse, the sign that action was at hand. "I knew," said he, "that a man was approaching who is educated, anxious, not in good health, and laboring under a nervous strain so severe that he has thrice resolved to depart before reaching our door, and thrice reconsidered the matter." I could not repress a laugh. "Come, Holmes, this is too much." "Not at all. His tread is that of a man accustomed neither to manual labor nor to military drill. He is heavy on the heel, but without the free confidence of sound health. The halts indicate indecision, the rapid recoveries, compulsion. And since no creditor mounts stairs with hesitation, and no friend calls at this hour in weather such as this, save upon urgent business, I think the remainder may be supplied without effort." There was a knock at the door. "Come in," said Holmes. The man who entered was one whom, once seen, could scarcely be forgotten. He was of middle height, perhaps a little above 40, though his hair, which was black and abundant, had been so violently streaked at the temples with premature grey that he might have passed for older. His face was thin and intelligent, the nose prominent, the mouth sensitive, and the eyes, those were the feature which most arrested me. They were of a pale grey, deep-set beneath dark brows, and had in them the haunted alertness of one who lives in expectation of some calamity. His clothing was good, though disordered in that particular manner which denotes a man accustomed to care little for appearances, until suddenly compelled by circumstance to care for them too much. His cravat had been tied hastily. His gloves, one of which he still clutched in his hand, were of excellent kid but badly buttoned. His coat was flecked with mud low at the hem, while his left cuff bore a faint stain of violet ink. A medical man notices such small marks almost in spite of himself, yet even as I observed them I knew that Holmes had already drawn from them conclusions far beyond my own. Our visitor stood for a moment just within the threshold and cast a quick, searching glance from Holmes to me. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" Holmes inclined his head. "And Dr. Watson, I presume. I've heard your name also." "Si, sir." He bowed with grave politeness in my direction, but his agitation was so evident that he did not wait to sit until Holmes had motioned him to the chair nearest the fire. "You are cold, Mr. Whitaker, Julian Whitaker." "You are cold, Mr. Whitaker, but not from the weather alone," said Holmes. "You have been under extraordinary strain. Pray compose yourself. You're safe here, whatever the nature of your difficulty." The man started and gripped the arms of his chair. "That is precisely what I do not know, Mr. Holmes. I do not know whether I am safe anywhere." Holmes leaned back, and his expression, though attentive, did not lose that air of almost languid detachment which so often misled the casual observer. Only I, who knew him well, saw that his whole mind had sprung forward like a hound slipping the leash. "Then perhaps," said he, "the sooner you place the facts before us, the better." Mr. Julian Whitaker moistened his lips. His hand trembled slightly as he removed his spectacles, polished them with unnecessary care, and replaced them. It was the gesture of a man attempting to impose order upon thought by ordering some trifling physical action. "You may think me mad," said he at last. "I have met several madmen," Holmes replied. "They rarely begin by fearing they may be one." A shadow of painful amusement crossed the visitor's face. "That is well said. Yet what I have to tell you would appear impossible if it had not happened repeatedly, and if, God help me, it had not led already to a man's death." At these words I straightened in my chair, while Holmes's fingers came together once more beneath his chin. "A death," said he softly. "Then the matter is indeed of interest." Whitaker gave a quick glance toward the fogged window, as though even there he expected to see a watcher. "I came to you because the police would not hear me with seriousness, and because another death may occur this very day." "Whose?" "I do not know." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "But you believe that it will occur?" "I do more than believe it. I was warned of it." "By whom?" The man's answer came in little more than a whisper. "By the same voice that warned me of the last." For an instant there was no sound in the room save the faint hiss of the coals. I have seen Holmes receive with equal composure confessions of murder, theft, blackmail, treason, and every other variety of human corruption, but there was in this case something so bizarre in its opening that even I, a veteran of his adventures though I was, felt that peculiar tightening at the chest which comes when reason first confronts the apparently preternatural. Holmes, however, merely reached for the tobacco pouch. "A voice," said he. "You will, I hope, be more explicit." "It began 10 days ago," said Whitaker. "I was alone in my study at 11:30 at night. I am by profession a lecturer in acoustics and experimental sound at King's College." Holmes gave a slight nod as one item found its place. I had been working upon certain notes connected with resonance in enclosed chambers. The house was perfectly still. My servant had retired. I remember distinctly that the fire had burned low and that the clock upon the mantel had just struck the half-hour. Then I heard, close by my right shoulder, a man's voice say, "Do not allow Ferguson to take the 12:15 train on Thursday." "And there was no one in the room?" I asked. "None." "You are certain it was not from the street?" "Entirely certain. It was as if the speaker stood within a foot of me." Holmes lit his pipe. "You say you lecture upon sound. You would therefore be less easily deceived than most men in matters of direction and vibration." "That is precisely why the thing so shook me. I searched the room. I opened the door. I went to the landing, to the servants' quarters, even to the street. There was no one." "And Ferguson," said Holmes. "My colleague, Arthur Ferguson. We were to travel together on the Thursday to inspect a private laboratory at Sevenoaks. He had spoken of taking the 12:15 from Charing Cross. You warned him." "I did. He laughed at me, and I did not tell him the true reason. I said only that I had received information that the train was unsafe." "And was it?" Whitaker's face grew several shades paler. "No. The train completed its journey without incident. Ferguson sent me a mocking telegram that evening. I'd almost persuaded myself that I had suffered some auditory delusion due to overwork when, on the following morning, I learned that he had been killed at 12:15, struck by a falling stone cornice while standing outside his club in Pall Mall." Neither Holmes nor I spoke. "The hour," said Whitaker, "was exact. Only the manner had been wrong, or rather, my interpretation of it had been wrong. He had not taken the train because, angered by my warning, he remained in town. Had he gone, he might have lived." He pressed both hands against his brow. "You see now why I dared tell no one the whole of it? They would have called it coincidence at best, insanity at worst. Yet 2 nights later, the voice came again." Holmes had not moved, but the pipe in his fingers had gone out unnoticed. "What did it say?" "When the glass breaks at number 18, do not open the door." That was all. "And did the glass break?" "At number 18 there lives an elderly widow, Mrs. Maberly, whom I know only by sight. The next evening, as I sat in my dining room, there came a terrible crash from the square outside. I ran to the window. One of the front windows at number 18 had been smashed from within. A maid was screaming at the door. People began to gather. I was halfway across the pavement when the warning returned to me, and I stopped." "You did not enter?" "No. 2 constables and a neighbor forced the door. Mrs. Maberly had collapsed beside the broken window, but it was not she who had broken it. Her nephew, who had been robbing her cash box, was hidden behind the door of the morning room with a poker in his hand. He struck the first man who entered and fractured his skull." Holmes's brows lifted. "A narrow escape." Whitaker gave a miserable nod. "I cannot say whether the voice saved me or merely arranged that another man should take my place. That question has tormented me every hour since. But there is more. Last night it came again." Holmes set down his extinguished pipe. "Now we approach the immediate problem." "Yes." Our visitor leaned forward, and for the first time his voice sank from agitation into a tone of utter dread. It said, "Before dusk tomorrow, the 3rd bell will ring for one who has not yet fallen." "The 3rd bell?" I repeated. "Yes, those exact words." Holmes rose at last and crossed to the mantelpiece, where he stood with his back to the fire, his head sunk, his hands beneath the tails of his dressing gown. To the stranger, he may have seemed merely thoughtful. To me, that posture was one of intense concentration. "When precisely did you hear this?" "At 20 minutes past midnight." "Again in your study?" "No, in my bedchamber." "And again with the same impression of nearness?" "Yes." Holmes turned sharply. "Male voice, educated, young, old?" "Male, certainly. Educated, yes. As to age, I cannot say. It was clear, measured, and utterly without emotion." "Accent?" "English. Perhaps London, but very slight." "Familiar?" Whitaker hesitated. "That is a question I have asked myself repeatedly." At moments I fancy there is something known in it, but when I try to fix it, the resemblance escapes me. Holmes glanced toward me. A most interesting detail. Do you attach significance to it? Asked Whitaker eagerly. I attach significance to everything until I have reason not to do so. Holmes resumed his seat. Now, Mr. Whitaker, before I proceed further, I should like to know whether you have concealed anything from us. The man's eyes widened. No. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Nothing bearing upon Ferguson's death. Nothing as to your own relations with him. Nothing as to Mrs. Maberly, her nephew, or any person who might profit by placing you in a state of terror. I have concealed nothing. Then I may begin by telling you something in return. You are unmarried. I live with a single elderly servant, have of late received at least one anonymous communication, and were this morning followed for part of your journey to Baker Street by a man in a dark overcoat who is either very clumsy or very confident. Julian Whitaker sprang half out of his chair. You saw him? I see the marks of him. Your right glove has fresh abrasion at the knuckles, such as comes from clutching a cab door while turning repeatedly to look behind you. There is mud on one coat skirt only, showing that you descended from the vehicle on the offside and paused in the roadway rather than at once taking the pavement. A man who does that in such traffic is not thinking of his boots but of pursuit. As for the anonymous communication, there is a square outline in your breast pocket of a folded note, and violet ink upon your cuff corresponding to the smear left by a hurriedly opened envelope. You have several times touched the pocket since entering. Finally, a bachelor who keeps one servant almost invariably misbuttons one glove when under stress, because there is no wife to correct the untidiness before he leaves the house. For the first time since his arrival, our visitor looked not frightened but astonished. It is extraordinary, he murmured. It is elementary, said Holmes dryly. The question is whether the facts themselves are extraordinary or merely made to appear so. May I see the note? With fumbling hands, Whitaker drew a folded sheet from his inner pocket and passed it over. Holmes opened it and laid it flat upon the table. I leaned forward. Upon the page, in block capitals roughly printed with violet ink, these were the words, "The third bell is for you. Speak to no policeman." There was no signature. Holmes examined the paper, then held it to the light. Cheap stationery, torn from a commercial pad. The letters are printed rather than written, an obvious disguise, though not a clever one. He raised it to his nose. A faint odor of machine oil. Watson, do you observe the pressure of the downstrokes? I cannot say that I do, because they are barely marked. The writer used a hard nib, probably a steel clerk's pen, and wrote upon an uneven surface. Not at a desk, then, perhaps standing. The ink is common, but the violet stain is less common in private correspondence. Mr. Whitaker, where did you receive this? It was pushed under my door at breakfast time. You kept the envelope? Yes. Holmes held out his hand, and in the envelope was produced likewise. It bore no address, only the same printed instruction. For Mr. Whitaker's own hand. Holmes studied it for a full minute in silence. Did your servant see who delivered it? No, she found it upon the mat. Has she noticed anyone loitering near the house? She says no, but she is nervous and not observant. No matter. Holmes placed both note and envelope aside. Now we come to the phrase itself. Before dusk tomorrow, the third bell will ring for one who has not yet fallen. Singularly theatrical. Does it convey anything to you? Any association with church bells, house bells, railway signals, lectures, laboratories, music, anything? Whitaker shook his head hopelessly. None. I have turned it over without ceasing. I cannot make sense of it. Nor can I, said Holmes, as which is precisely why it interests me. I had noticed during this exchange that my friend's languor had wholly vanished. His face, though composed, had taken on that keen ascetic look which comes upon it when every faculty is engaged. He rose briskly and began to pace before the hearth. "It is tempting," said he, "to clothe the matter at once in supernatural garments, a warning voice, accurate foreknowledge, anonymous threats, a death already accomplished, and another apparently impending. Yet experience, my dear Watson, has taught me that when a case appears to transcend nature, it usually means only that some very natural rogues have been exceptionally ingenious." "You think, then, that Mr. Whitaker is being deceived?" "I think nothing yet. I observe. To think prematurely is to handicap oneself." He wheeled suddenly upon our client. "You have spoken of Ferguson as a colleague. Were you on good terms?" "Excellent terms." "Any professional rivalry?" "None of consequence." "Any private disagreement?" "No." "Was he married?" "A widower." "Children?" "One daughter in school at Bath." "Money difficulties?" "Not that I know of." Holmes nodded and changed direction with the abruptness of a bird in flight. "And Mrs. Maberly's nephew, the one with the poker? I never saw him before that night." "Yet he might have seen you." "Yes." "And known that had you entered first, you would have been the injured man." Whitaker passed a hand over his mouth. "I have thought of that also." "Good. It is well to think broadly, though not too loosely." Holmes stopped. One final question for now. Why come to me only after the third warning? Why not after the first?" The answer was delivered with painful frankness. "Because after the first I feared for my reason. After the second I feared for my reputation. After the third I feared for my life." There was something in the simplicity of the words which impressed me more deeply than any display of terror could have done. Holmes, too, seemed struck by it, for his expression softened a trifle. "You did right to come," said he. Whitaker let out a breath which seemed half a groan. "Then you will take the case?" "My dear sir, I'd taken it before you finished the account of the broken window." Our visitor sank back, visibly relieved, though his eyes still darted toward the door at the least sound from the landing. Holmes rang the bell for Mrs. and Hudson and requested coffee. When she had departed, he stood for some moments looking down into the fire. I've learned to disturb him little at such times, for his mind works then in swift, silent syntheses impossible to interrupt without cost. At last he turned. "Watson," said he, "kindly make a note of the principal points. We shall likely need them in sequence." I drew my notebook from my pocket. "First," said Holmes, counting upon his fingers, 3 warnings delivered by an apparently disembodied voice. Second, the first connected, accurately in time but inaccurately in apparent form, with the death of Arthur Ferguson. Third, the second resulting in Mr. Whitaker's avoidance of personal danger at number 18. Fourth, an anonymous note using the image of the third bell. Fifth, evidence, unproved, though but probable, that our client is under surveillance. Sixth, the possibility that all these incidents are linked by deliberate design rather than by coincidence. Seventh." He broke off. A sound had come from below. It was faint, but in the hush of the room, unmistakable. The sharp, metallic pull of the front door bell. Mrs. Hudson's step crossed the hall. There followed a murmur, then another sound. The bell again. Whitaker's face had gone ashen. Holmes held up a hand for silence. A pause. Then, distinct and solemn through the fog-muted stillness of Baker Street, the bell rang a third time. No one spoke. Even the fire seemed to have ceased its whispering. Whitaker had risen to his feet, both hands gripping the back of his chair with such force that the knuckles stood white beneath the skin. "My God," he whispered. And the third bell. Holmes was across the room in 2 strides. His whole figure had changed. The dreamer of the settee was gone, and in his place stood the most formidable man of action I have ever known. "Not a word," said he. "Watson, with me. Mr. Whitaker, remain where you are until I call." Without waiting for reply, He flung open the door and darted to the head of the stairs, while I snatched up my revolver from the drawer of the escritoire and followed close upon his heels. What awaited us below, and how that ominous summons drew us into one of the most singular and perilous investigations of my career, I shall endeavour to relate in the next chapter. Holmes reached the landing in 2 silent strides, and I followed so closely that my shoulder nearly brushed the wall. The fog from the street had crept faintly through the lower panes of the hall window, casting the entrance in a dull yellow haze. From below came the muted murmur of Mrs. Hudson's voice, tremulous and uncertain. Holmes raised a hand to halt me and leaned slightly over the banister. "Mrs. Hudson," said he calmly, though his voice carried a note of authority that would have arrested a charging cavalry horse, "who is at the door?" Her reply floated upward with evident relief. "A gentleman asking for Mr. Whitaker, sir." Holmes's eyes flicked toward me for an instant, bright and sharp. "Ask his name," he called down. There followed a pause. I heard the door open wider, a faint exchange of words, and then Mrs. Hudson again. "He says his name is Inspector Lestrade, sir." Holmes's lips curved in a thin, almost amused smile. Indeed." He descended the remaining steps at once, and I closed behind him. The door stood half open, admitting a breath of damp November air and the outline of a familiar figure framed against the grey fog outside. Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard stood upon the threshold, his narrow shoulders hunched against the cold. His keen, ferret-like face bore the expression of a man who has arrived upon business which he believes to be both urgent and delicate. "Well, Mr. Holmes," said he briskly, stepping inside and removing his hat. "I might have guessed you'd be involved in this before the morning was over." Holmes closed the door behind him. "That is interesting, Lestrade," said he mildly. "You arrive asking for Mr. Julian Whitaker at precisely the moment he sits upstairs consulting me about a matter connected with your department." Lestrade blinked. "He's here. At this moment. Well, that saves a bit of legwork." Holmes regarded him closely. "Before we summon him, perhaps you would tell us what brings you." The inspector gave a short laugh. "It's a queer business, Mr. Holmes. Queer enough that I thought it best to come quietly before making any official stir. You know how these things look if they turn out to be nonsense." Holmes folded his arms. "I should be delighted to hear the nonsense." Lestrade glanced briefly toward the staircase, lowering his voice. "A man named Arthur Ferguson was killed 3 days ago." "I am aware of the fact," said Holmes. "You are?" "Our client upstairs informed us of it not 10 minutes ago." Lestrade's eyebrows climbed a fraction. "That explains a good deal. I was wondering how Mr. Whitaker had come to be mixed up in the matter." Holmes's tone remained pleasantly neutral. "Mixed up in what way?" Lestrade drew a small notebook from his pocket. "Because Ferguson's death isn't as simple as it looked at first glance." "How so?" "Well, when the body was examined more closely, it turned out the stone cornice that struck him hadn't fallen naturally at all. It had been tampered with." I felt Holmes stiffen slightly beside me. "You mean it was pushed?" "Precisely." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "And you have reason to connect this with Mr. Whitaker?" "Indirectly, perhaps. Ferguson and Whitaker were known to work together at King's College, but that's not the main point." "What is?" Lestrade tapped his notebook. "A witness." Holmes inclined his head. "Go on." "A newspaper seller across the street claims that shortly before the stone fell, he saw a gentleman standing beside Ferguson, talking to him." "And this gentleman?" "Tall, thin, dark overcoat, face partly hidden by the brim of a hat." Holmes's gaze flickered for a moment toward the stair above. "And the witness heard anything of their conversation?" "Just one sentence." Holmes's voice grew very quiet. "What sentence?" Lestrade looked from Holmes to me, evidently enjoying the dramatic effect of his revelation. "He says the stranger told Ferguson, 'You should have taken the train.'" For an instant, neither Holmes nor I spoke. The inspector closed his notebook with a snap. That line struck me as odd enough to pursue. When I made inquiries at King's College, I learned Ferguson had been planning to take the 12:15 train that day, but had changed his mind suddenly after a conversation with Mr. Whitaker the previous morning. Holmes nodded slowly. So naturally you came to speak with Mr. Whitaker. Exactly. And you chose to do so privately rather than summon him officially. Lestrade shrugged. Well, the evidence is thin. A coincidence, perhaps. But there's another thing. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Yes? The witness said something else about the man in the overcoat. What? That after the stone fell and Ferguson dropped, the fellow didn't run, didn't even look surprised. He just stood there a moment, then turned and walked away into the fog. Holmes turned his head slightly, listening, when from upstairs came the faint creak of a floorboard. Whitaker. Holmes spoke without raising his voice. Watson, if you would kindly ask Mr. Whitaker to join us. I ascended halfway up the stairs and found our client waiting at the landing, his expression drawn with anxiety. They have come for me, he said in a hoarse whisper. No, said I. They have come for answers. He descended with me, though I could feel the tremor in his arm as he passed the final step. Lestrade studied him sharply. Mr. Julian Whitaker? Yes. I'm Inspector Lestrade from Scotland Yard. I'm afraid I must ask you a few questions regarding the death of Arthur Ferguson. Whitaker's lips parted. You believe I had something to do with it? That depends on your answers. Holmes intervened gently. Perhaps, Lestrade, it would be best if Mr. Whitaker first told you the account he has already given Dr. Watson and myself. Lestrade frowned. What account? Holmes gestured toward the sitting room. The account of the voice. The inspector stared at him. The voice? Holmes's expression was perfectly serious. Yes, the one that warned him Ferguson would die. Lestrade gave a short bark of laughter. Come now, Mr. Holmes. Surely you're not entertaining ghost stories. Holmes's eyes glinted. On the contrary, my dear Lestrade, I find them very instructive. Whitaker stepped forward suddenly. It is not a ghost story, he said with desperate earnestness. Someone is warning me of deaths before they occur. Lestrade looked from him to Holmes with growing impatience. And you believe that? Holmes's voice was quiet. I believe that someone wants Mr. Whitaker to believe it. The inspector folded his arms. Why? Holmes smiled faintly. That is the question. At that very moment, a dull metallic clang echoed faintly through the fog outside. All four of us turned instinctively toward the door. From somewhere in the distance came the slow, solemn toll of a bell. 1, 2. Whitaker's face drained of color. Holmes's eyes flashed toward the street. Then the bell sounded again, deep and resonant. 3. The third toll had scarcely faded into the fog before Holmes seized his hat from the stand and flung open the door. Come, Watson, he cried. I had no need of further invitation. The urgency in his voice would have roused the dead. Lestrade, after a moment's astonished hesitation, followed us out into Baker Street while behind us, Mr. Whitaker stood motionless upon the threshold, like a man who has suddenly glimpsed his own executioner. The fog lay thick and yellow in the street, rolling sluggishly between the houses and muffling the sounds of London into a distant, hollow murmur. Holmes paused for only a heartbeat upon the pavement, his keen eyes sweeping the dim thoroughfare. There, he said sharply. Through the drifting haze, perhaps 50 yards away at the corner of the street, the outline of a church tower rose faintly against the pale sky. The bell which had just sounded belonged unmistakably to that structure. St. Matthew's, if my recollection served me correctly. Holmes had already begun striding toward it with that long, rapid gait which I have seen carry him across half the city when some clue beckoned him onward. What do you make of it? I asked, and keeping pace beside him. That depends entirely upon what we find at the bell, he replied curtly. Lestrade hurried after us, his boots striking sharply against the pavement. Surely you don't think there's anything in this business of bells and prophecies, he protested. Holmes did not slow. "My dear Lestrade, I think only that someone has gone to extraordinary trouble to ensure that we hear 3 bells at a moment of dramatic convenience. And why should they do that?" Holmes's answer was delivered over his shoulder. "To convince Mr. Whitaker that fate itself is pursuing him." We reached the iron gate of the churchyard within a minute. Holmes pushed it open without ceremony and strode up the gravel path toward the side entrance of the church. The building stood silent and imposing amid the fog, though its stone walls were damp with condensation and the narrow windows glimmered faintly with the dim light filtering through the mist. Holmes halted suddenly. "Listen." From somewhere within the building came the faint echo of footsteps. Not the measured tread of a clergyman, but the hurried retreat of someone moving quickly across stone. Holmes sprang forward and flung open the side door. The interior of the church was dim, lit only by the pale grey light that seeped through the stained glass. The air smelled faintly of dust and candle wax. Across the nave, near the far aisle, a figure in a dark overcoat had just reached the opposite door. "Stop!" shouted Lestrade. The man did not stop. Instead, he dashed through the doorway and vanished into the fog beyond. Holmes ran at once. We followed him through the church, our footsteps echoing sharply beneath the vaulted ceiling. By the time we burst out the opposite door, however, the street beyond was empty. The fog had swallowed the fleeing man completely. Lestrade swore under his breath. "Gone! Blast it all!" Holmes stood perfectly still for several seconds, his head slightly inclined, listening. Then he turned slowly and re-entered the church. "Holmes," said I, "you don't mean to abandon the chase?" "It would be pointless," he replied calmly. "A man who understands fog as well as that fellow clearly does will have vanished long before we reach the next corner." Lestrade rejoined us with an irritated expression. "Well, we've lost him now." Holmes ignored the remark. Instead, he walked deliberately toward the narrow spiral staircase that rose beside the inner wall. "The bell tower," he said quietly. We ascended the steps together. The narrow stair twisted upward through cold stone, each footfall echoing in the confined space. At the top, we emerged into the small chamber where the great bronze bell hung, suspended above us. Holmes approached it at once. The rope still swayed slightly. Lestrade stared at it. "So he rang it," said the inspector. Holmes crouched beside the rope's base. "Yes," he murmured. He touched the floorboards with his fingertips. "Recently, the dust has been disturbed." Lestrade folded his arms. "That proves nothing except that someone rang the bell." Holmes rose slowly. "On the contrary, it proves a very great deal." "How so?" Holmes gestured toward the rope. "The bell was not rung by the church sexton, and it was rung by a man who wished to create a precise signal." Lestrade frowned. "A signal to whom?" Holmes's eyes gleamed faintly. "To Mr. Julian Whitaker." I stared at him. "You mean the warnings? The voice, the bells, all part of the same scheme?" Holmes nodded. "Precisely." Lestrade looked unconvinced. "But why frighten him with all this theatrical nonsense?" Holmes moved toward the narrow tower window and peered down into the fog-covered street. "That," said he quietly, "is the question upon which the entire mystery depends." He turned back to us, his expression grave. For if a man goes to such lengths merely to frighten another, it is usually because terror is only the first step of his design. "And the second?" I asked. Holmes's gaze drifted toward Baker Street, where somewhere in the distance Mr. Whitaker waited alone. "The second," he said softly, "is murder." Holmes's last words still hung in the cold air of the tower when a sudden realization seemed to strike him with the force of a physical blow. He turned sharply toward the stair. "Watson, Lestrade, we have wasted enough time here." "What do you mean?" asked the inspector. Holmes's reply came with rare urgency. "Mr. Whitaker." Without another explanation, he plunged down the spiral staircase, taking the steps 3 at a time. I followed closely, while Lestrade, muttering something about confounded theatrics, hurried after us. By the time we burst once more into the churchyard, the fog had thickened further, creeping low across the ground like a living thing. Holmes did not pause, but strode rapidly back toward Baker Street. "You think he is in danger now?" I asked. Holmes's voice was tight. "I think the bells were not meant merely to frighten him. They were meant to delay us." Lestrade snorted. "Delay you? How could anyone know you'd run off chasing a church bell?" Holmes did not look back. Because the man who rang it understands human psychology extremely well. He knew precisely how the symbolism of the third bell would affect both Mr. Whitaker and myself. We reached Baker Street in scarcely more than 2 minutes, though it felt considerably longer in that suffocating fog. Holmes sprang up the steps of 221B and threw open the door. "Mrs. Hudson," he called. Her anxious face appeared at once from the hallway. "Oh, Mr. Holmes, you've returned. The gentleman upstairs—" Holmes brushed past her. "What of him?" "I thought I heard voices," she said nervously. "Gee, just a moment ago." Holmes did not wait to hear more. He ran up the stairs and I closed behind him. The sitting-room door stood partly open. Holmes pushed it wide. For a moment, none of us spoke. The room was empty. The chair where Whitaker had been sitting remained beside the fire. His hat still lay upon the table. But the man himself was gone. Lestrade strode forward immediately. "Now what the devil—" Holmes had already crossed the room and reached the window. He examined the latch, then the sill. "Open from within," he said quietly. I joined him. "Do you think he left voluntarily?" Holmes pointed toward the carpet. "Observe." Near the window, the rug had been slightly displaced, revealing the polished floor beneath. Beside it lay a small object glinting faintly in the lamplight. Lestrade bent and picked it up. "A button," he said. Holmes took it from him. "From a glove," he murmured. I felt a sudden chill. The man in the overcoat. Holmes nodded once. "It appears our visitor did not depart alone." Lestrade swore softly. "You mean someone came up here while we were chasing that bell ringer?" Holmes walked slowly back toward the door, his eyes scanning the room with rapid precision. "That is the inevitable conclusion." But Mrs. Hudson said nothing about a stranger entering. Holmes stopped beside the fireplace. "Because he did not enter by the front door." Lestrade frowned. "Then how?" Holmes gestured toward the back of the room. "The service stair." The inspector stared. "The one the servants use?" "Precisely." Holmes's gaze had grown very sharp. A quiet approach from the rear alley, up the service steps, directly to this landing. No need to pass Mrs. Hudson at all. Lestrade rubbed his chin. "Then while we were at the church, someone came here and took Whitaker." Holmes's voice remained calm, though there was now a steely edge beneath it. "Yes. But why?" Holmes looked again at the glove button in his hand. For the same reason the voice warned him. The bells rang, and Ferguson died. "And that reason is?" Holmes slipped the button into his pocket. "To ensure that Mr. Julian Whitaker does not live long enough to understand what he has truly been hearing." I felt my pulse quicken. "You mean the voice? The warnings?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Were never supernatural at all." Lestrade folded his arms. "Well, if someone's gone to all this trouble just to frighten a college lecturer, they must have a powerful motive." Holmes moved toward the door again. "Yes," he said quietly. "And I believe we have just reached the point where that motive will reveal itself." He paused at the threshold and turned to us. "For unless we find Mr. Whitaker quickly, the fourth warning will not be a prediction." His gaze hardened. "It will be an obituary." Holmes stood silent for several seconds after speaking those grave words, his eyes fixed thoughtfully upon the floor near the displaced rug. I've often observed that in the moments immediately following some critical discovery, his mind seems to retreat inward, arranging facts with the quiet precision of a watchmaker assembling delicate gears. It was clear to me that such a process was now taking place. Lestrade, however, was not a man inclined to patience. "So well," he demanded, "are we to stand about here speculating while the fellow who took Whitaker gets a head start across half of London?" Holmes looked up sharply. "On the contrary, Lestrade, we shall give him no start at all. You know where he's taken him?" Holmes picked up Whitaker's hat from the table and examined it absently. "I believe I know why he has taken him. Once that question is answered, the rest becomes almost inevitable." I stepped closer. "Then you already suspect the identity of the man behind all this?" Holmes replaced the hat carefully upon the table. "Not suspect, Watson. Conclude." Lestrade snorted impatiently. "Well then, perhaps you'd care to enlighten the rest of us." Holmes smiled faintly. "All in good time. First, we must retrieve Mr. Whitaker, who at present is the most valuable witness in the matter." "And where do you propose we find him?" Holmes moved toward the mantel and tapped thoughtfully at the ashes in his pipe. "At King's College." Lestrade stared. "The college? Why there?" Holmes turned calmly. "Because every element of this strange affair originates in Mr. Whitaker's professional world. His experiments, his colleague Ferguson, and most importantly, the phenomenon of the voice itself." "You mean the warnings?" "Yes." Holmes's eyes brightened. "Mr. Whitaker is an expert in acoustics. His entire life's work concerns the transmission and manipulation of sound. As if a man wished to create the illusion of disembodied voices. Voices that appear beside one's shoulder in an otherwise empty room. Whom better to target than a specialist whose research might provide the very means to achieve it?" Lestrade scratched his head. "You're suggesting someone used Whitaker's own science against him?" "Precisely," Holmes continued. "Consider the sequence. A voice warns him of Ferguson's death. The warning proves accurate in time, but ambiguous in form. That ambiguity forces Whitaker to interpret the prophecy incorrectly, ensuring Ferguson's death still occurs." "And the second warning?" I asked. "Serves to strengthen Whitaker's belief that the voice possesses supernatural foresight." Lestrade frowned. "But why go to all that trouble?" Holmes's voice grew quieter. "To prepare him for the final step." "And what is that?" Holmes met his gaze directly. "To silence him." We left Baker Street within minutes and secured a cab, urging the driver toward the Strand with all possible speed. Holmes sat forward the entire journey, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, while the fog-dimmed streets slid past us like ghostly corridors. At last, the cab halted before the stone entrance of King's College. Holmes stepped down instantly. "This way." We crossed the courtyard and entered the quiet academic building. A porter glanced up from his desk as we approached. "Mr. Julian Whitaker," Holmes said briskly. "Has he returned here this morning?" The porter shook his head. "No, sir." Holmes nodded, as though the answer merely confirmed something he already knew. "And Professor Arthur Ferguson's laboratory?" "Second floor, east wing." Holmes turned without another word and ascended the stairs. When we reached the corridor outside the laboratory door, Holmes halted and listened. From within came a faint sound, the scrape of a chair. Holmes pushed the door open. Inside, beneath the pale light of the tall windows, stood a man in a dark overcoat. Beside him sat Julian Whitaker, bound to a chair. The stranger turned slowly. His face, thin and intellectual beneath a narrow hat, bore a faint smile. "Well done, Mr. Holmes," he said calmly. Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Good morning, Professor Lionel Granger." Whitaker gasped. "Granger!" Lestrade stepped forward at once. "You know this man?" Holmes answered before either could speak. Professor Granger is, or rather was, Arthur Ferguson's rival in the field of acoustic research." Granger laughed softly. "Rival? That is a generous word. Holmes continued. Ferguson had recently developed a method for transmitting sound through concealed resonant channels, allowing a voice to appear to originate from any location within a room. Whitaker stared in horror. The experiment we were discussing last month. Yes, said Holmes. Granger learned of it, but Ferguson refused to share the full details. Lestrade's eyes narrowed. So he killed him. Granger shrugged faintly. A regrettable necessity. Holmes's voice remained steady, but that alone would not secure the research. Mr. Whitaker possessed the final calculations. Whitaker whispered hoarsely. You made me believe I was hearing voices. Granger nodded pleasantly. A few small devices hidden near your study walls. Ingenious little transmitters. Once I understood Ferguson's principle, it was simplicity itself. Lestrade moved forward. And the bells? A theatrical flourish, Granger said coolly. Fear is far more persuasive when it appears inevitable. Holmes gestured toward the ropes binding Whitaker. You intended to kill him once he revealed the formula. Granger's smile faded slightly. That was the plan. Lestrade placed a firm hand upon the man's shoulder. Well, Professor, the plan's finished. Granger did not resist as the inspector secured him. Holmes stepped forward and untied Whitaker's bonds. The poor fellow sagged with relief. You saved my life, he murmured. Holmes shook his head lightly. Not at all. Your own science saved it. How? Holmes gestured around the laboratory. The very mechanism Granger used to deceive you also betrayed him. Only someone deeply familiar with acoustic projection could stage such illusions so precisely. Lestrade led the prisoner toward the door. Well, Mr. Holmes, I'll admit, you saw through it faster than I did. Holmes smiled faintly. The supernatural is merely the natural we do not yet understand. Later that evening, as we sat once more beside the familiar fire at Baker Street, I reflected upon the strange path by which fear, science, and murder had intertwined. Holmes lay stretched upon the sofa, his violin resting idle beside him. A curious case, Watson, said he. Indeed, I replied. The man who heard the future was really hearing a murderer. Holmes closed his eyes. Precisely. Then after a pause, he added softly, and that, my dear Watson, is why reason must always be louder than fear.